All right, we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Lauren McGoodwin, founder and CEO of Career Contessa. Welcome to today's webinar, How to Respond to Microaggressions at Work. I'm so thrilled to be here today talking about this important topic. We have Felicia Jadczak. She is the co-CEO / co-founder / co-everything with this other amazing woman named Rachel Marie of She Geeks Out. I'll put a link to that in the live chat in a second. But hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. You guys are so amazing. You already know the drill. If you are joining us live, which is right now, go ahead and let us know where you're joining us from. I'm in Los Angeles in the Career Contessa office. Felicia, where are you joining us from?
I'm actually joining us from right outside Boston, Massachusetts, so on the opposite coast.
Yeah, we're like as far as you can, almost as far as you can get. Yeah, we are really spanning the U.S. there. Yeah, and happy Canada Day to Canadians out there. I remember when I worked at Hulu, we would always celebrate Canada Day. That was really fun. Awesome. So you guys who are brand new, first time joining us from the webinar, let me just kind of go over some housekeeping items so you know how to use all the tools. So live chat, you guys are already figuring it out. That's where you can connect with each other. It's kind of our ongoing dialogue place for the live webinar. So right below Felicia and I, it says ask a question. Put your questions in there that you want us to answer. We're going to spend about 30 minutes, on content, 30 minutes answering your questions. Upvote the questions that you have the same one of so that we're kind of efficiently running through those. And what I love about this tool, this webinar platform, Crowdcast, is that we can record our answers to your questions. So if you're watching the replay, you don't have to watch the whole thing. If you don't want to, you can just listen to our answers. So that's kind of how it's going to work. Live chat, ask a question. Everybody will get emailed a replay, access to the replay of this webinar. If for some reason you lose that email, all you have to do is go to webinars on Career Contessa. Since you've already registered, you'll just click the little green button to sign back in. Okay, that sounds like most of the housekeeping items. All right, Felicia, tell us who you are, She Geeks Out, do the whole intro thing so people know why this work is important to you.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Lauren. And one more time, hi to everybody. Really excited to be here. It's my first time doing one of these webinars, and so really thrilled to be with all of you in this virtual space. As Lauren mentioned earlier, I'm Felicia Jadczak. I am the co-founder and co-CEO of a small business theoretically based in Boston, Massachusetts. I like to say theoretically because really, what is time? What is space?
It's a wall, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
We're all virtual all the time, but we were founded in Boston, and so we just actually hit our 5-year business birthday in March of this year.
Congrats, that's awesome.
Thank you. Yes, it was definitely a very different celebration than we would have planned originally, but it's all good. We're happy to be here. She Geeks Out, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we have two sides to our organization. On the one hand, we offer and support community for, we say, tech and tech adjacent women and their allies with a very inclusive definition of women. And so we hold different events such as networking events, happy hours, professional development, workshops, panels, things like that. On the other side of the business, which is really where I spend more of my time and in sort of what capacity I'm coming to speak with all of you today, we run diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings and programming for companies from all different industries, all shapes and sizes. And really overall, we're very focused on thinking and working on how to create and support inclusive organizations for everyone. And when I think you asked me how I came to this work, my background personally is I spent most of my career in the tech space working for different companies. Most recently was working at a company called VMware, which is based out in the Bay Area in the US, and running different programs around innovation for them. And as some of you might be able to see, my sign back here, Innovation Street, is a holdover from that time in my life. But that's really how I started to come to this work, because I was doing a lot of research internally and had started an employee resource group for VMware's female software engineers back in 2012 or so. And so that really kickstarted my interest and desire to learn more about this work, and have since done a lot of self-education, a lot of work, and really am immersed in it to a much deeper level today.
Amazing. So we're super fortunate to have Felicia here. And you guys, we've actually done 2 podcast episodes together as well. One was in the summer of 2019 about how to navigate power and privilege in the workplace, which was before its time, obviously, but that's amazing. It's a really good part 1 basic introduction to power and privilege. I think there's still a lot of misconceptions around what is privilege, so I highly recommend listening to that. And then the other one that we just did recently is how to be actively anti-racist at work and life. So 2 amazing resources to binge on in addition to this webinar. So we're here to talk about microaggressions, and I think we should always start with making sure we have the same understanding of what is a microaggression.
Yes, that is a great question and probably the perfect place to start when we're talking about this topic. So the way that I typically get into discussions around microaggressions in general is I actually like to start with bias, because bias in general, whether it's conscious or unconscious, can play out in a number of different ways. It could play out in your words and your actions. And so another term that people use to describe this process is a microaggression. And it's basically a way that our biases can manifest. This terminology has been around for quite some time, I think since at least the 70s, and originally from a professor at Harvard. The definition that I like to use in my everyday life in work comes from the work of a professor out of Columbia named Dr. Gerald Wing Su. And he defines microaggressions as the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or even environmental indignities, whether it's intended or unintended, that basically have the result of communicating hostile, derogatory, or even negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, religious ability, whatever that sort of fill in the blank is, slights or insults. And I know that's quite a mouthful, and I'll be happy to unpack that a bit further, but essentially the key things to just keep in mind as we start to talk about microaggressions is that anyone can commit a microaggression, so it's not reserved for one special group of people. And you can also commit microaggressions and be on the receiving end of microaggressions. And while the origin of the terminology was more for race-related incidents, it has expanded in terms of how people use and view it in today's world. So it's not just about racial interactions, it's a lot more and a lot broader than that today.
I'm reading How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and he calls microaggressions abuse. You know, he's like, this is the term, but it's abuse. It's abusive actions and behavior. So I find, and he has an interesting story. So it is a term that's been around for a while, and I know it started to represent actions toward people of different races, specifically I think Black people. But it definitely has expanded, and I think also to your point, you can receive microaggressions and you can also give microaggressions. So I think that this is. I'm finding that in a lot of these conversations, things are almost always rooted back to kind of education and self-awareness too. So anyway, that's, so I want to talk about what are the types of microaggressions that are out there? And I know there's probably a lot, but maybe we can kind of have some common or, buckets, I guess, to say what are the types?
Absolutely. And another note too, before we get any further, because I'm trying to look at some of the chat that's coming through, and really appreciate everyone sharing. And I'm also seeing that a lot of people are chiming in who aren't from the US or from outside, and which is wonderful. And I do want to note that some of the discussion will be given from a more US-centric, Americanized point of view, or even Westernized point of view. And so as we're talking, if there are things that come to mind for any of you who are participating right now and on the webinar that you can add to the conversation or help give a little bit of additional insight or other ways of looking at this, that would be really great. Would love to see your insights as well. But in terms of your question, Lauren, the different types, there's of course a lot of different ways that microaggressions can come into play. We tend to look at them from the SGO lens, and using again the work of Dr. Su as a guideline for us, we look at it in 3 different types, or 3 different forms even. So the first is what we call a micro assault. So that's really basically something that's very conscious and purposeful. What that can look like is what we call sort of old-fashioned racism, calling someone colored or Oriental, which is not language that we use, a physical assault on someone. There's a lot of other ways that this can show up, but that's the first form, or the first bucket, really. The second type or form is a micro insult, which tends to be a little bit more of a subtle snub. It could be intentional, but a lot of times it comes out where it's not conscious, it's not intended on the part of the person who's delivering the micro insult, but the result of it conveys insensitivity or even has the result of demeaning someone's heritage or their identity. So how that can show up is if you have a person of color at your job and they're asked, oh, how did you get this job? Or, I think the most qualified person should get this job, no matter what their race or gender is. The underlying message is that micro insult there, that, oh, just because someone is of a different identity, different color, different gender than what the norm is or what the rest of the company looks like, then because of that and not because of any other reason, they must be unqualified for the job. And like I said, clear examples out there too. And then certainly last but not least, the last bucket is a micro invalidation. And these can show up as comments, behaviors, different cues that really have the result of negating the reality of someone who's in a marginalized or underrepresented group. So this is where you see people saying things like, oh, I don't see color, I'm colorblind. And what that comment basically does is it's denying the reality of a lot of us in this world who don't have that luxury, that privilege of saying, oh, color has no impact on me. Or in the US, what we see a lot of times come up as an example for this last type around microinvalidations is if you have someone who's of Asian descent and someone's talking to them and they say something like, oh, what's your real name? Or, oh, you speak really good English. Where are you really from? So that's a microinvalidation, invalidating their reality, their experience, their life.
Yeah, I've witnessed all of those. And I'm curious, how many people in the chat have you witnessed or experienced one of those three types? I know, especially when I was a recruiter, there was a time when I brought resumes to a hiring manager, and it was a name that the hiring manager didn't recognize. Their resume was amazing, and I remember him being like, no one's ever going to be able to pronounce his name, and put it to the side as like, we're not even going to bother with that. So I think these moments sometimes are incredibly obvious. And then of course there are some incredibly less obvious. And then when you go back and you think about it, you're like, what just happened? That's another thing about microaggressions. I feel like sometimes they happen so quickly or happen in a way where you kind of have this moment where you're like, what just happened? Did they really just say that? So, yeah. So, okay. Next question I have on here is, can you provide some examples of work microaggressions? And maybe people in the chat can, now that they've heard this, they can even share their examples. But yeah, can you share some examples of work microaggressions? And maybe we could do it for race, but also gender. I think there's a couple of people who are talking about that in here too.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly there's a ton of different examples, unfortunately, to really draw from. So, and I want to say too, microaggressions aren't limited to just a work experience or a personal experience. And of course they can happen anywhere at all times. And, you can receive microaggressions from your own friends and family. So I do want to name that and put that out there. And so when we're talking about different types or examples and trying to recognize what this is and how it shows up, a couple things that might come up are, especially in a workplace context, let's say that you are looking at your employee base, if you're a manager, for example, and you're like, oh, we have flex time, but no one really uses it. And then if someone's actually making use of that flex time because perhaps they're a parent or they're a caregiver and they need to have different, timings in terms of when they're online, or in a world where we're able to be in physical spaces together when they're coming and going from the office, you might look at that employee as being less dedicated, less committed, not as engaged as someone who isn't taking advantage of that. Another workplace example could be more around religion. And so a lot of times we need to have separate spaces in our workplaces for people who are practicing different religions. And if we're not providing that space, And also, it doesn't even have to be religion. It could be for parents. If you have someone who is nursing or who needs separate spaces for that, are we providing that space or not? I can tell you that personally, I'm not a parent, but I've worked in many offices where there either has been no nursing room, or the nursing room, such as it is, has been always sort of taken over by people who are like, oh, I need a phone booth, so I'm just going to walk into this room and I don't need it, but I'm going to just use the space, even though it's not set aside for me. Mispronouncing people's names, I think you mentioned that as well. That's a really common one that comes up, or saying, oh, it's just too hard for me to pronounce, or I'll just never get it. Other examples could also be mistaking people who have similar or the same identities for each other. So for example, let's say that you have someone in your office who constantly confuses the two Latina people who are working there for each other, and then just saying, oh, whatever, or oh, I can't be bothered, they all look the same. Like, those kinds of comments can come up too. Even saying things like, language that we don't use anymore, like, oh, that's so gay, or, things like, oh, that's retarded. And I'm only using this as an example. So
yeah.
But, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. And when I was growing up, that was very common. And it was just stuff that we didn't even think to question. But now we understand that it's not acceptable. But we still see it happening. Another example that I want to name as well is interactions. And so assuming heteronormativity. And what I mean by that is assuming that if you were to work with me, that because I present as a woman, that I would have a partner who is a man, and saying, oh, can you make sure to bring your husband or your boyfriend to the next work party? And, maybe I do have a partner who's a man, but maybe I don't. And you are making assumptions about your fellow employees or fellow coworkers based off of how you think they should be presenting or showing up, and sort of either not understanding that people have, different identities, or even misgendering them, things like that. We could probably keep going down a list of examples the entire week of the webinar. And I feel like there's probably a couple additional examples coming through in the chat.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of examples in the chat. And you guys, I'm really sorry. I mean, some of these examples are, it makes me really sad. We had someone put in our DMs today that she went for a job at an investment bank, and the man told her in the interview, as a Latina woman, I don't think you would do very well here. Like, there are just so many of these. The word microaggressions is almost like not enough to describe what's happening all the time.
Not to interrupt you, but I want to add one more thought too. And I know you kind of touched on this already, Lauren, in terms of thinking through how people might feel if they're on the receiving end of microaggression. And I want to name that just because it's called a microaggression versus a macroaggression doesn't mean that it doesn't have a really immense impact on the people who are receiving these. And I think I saw in some of the chat as well, especially earlier, that, there's a lot of things that you have to deal with if you are someone who may be from a more marginalized or underrepresented group who has to deal with microaggressions on a daily basis sometimes. And so a lot of times when people are either on the receiving or committing end of the microaggression, if you're receiving it, you might think, oh, it's so minor, like, oh, this person just can't get my name right, whatever. I can tell you as someone, so I'm biracial and I'm half Indian, half Polish. And so my name comes from the Polish side, but because I look vaguely brown, a lot of times people mistake me for being Latina. And so they'll pronounce my name as Felicia, and I'll correct and I'll say it's Felicia, and it just does not compute at all. And, so a lot of times it'll be like, oh, it's not a big deal, whatever. But, and that's just the one sort of more minor example. And I'm saying that from my own experience. But if you're on the receiving end of microaggressions day in and day out, it's like this idea of the 1,000 paper cuts. If you have one paper cut, it's not a big deal, unless you're a really big one like me. 2 paper cuts, you can probably deal with it. But if you just are covered in thousands of paper cuts at all times, it becomes very overwhelming. And it has a really detrimental effect on your work, on your health, on your sleep, your life in general. We talk a lot about how do you bring your authentic self to work? How do you really show up? And if you're dealing with things that have to do with microaggressions, that's going to take away from you being able to just really be present and do your work. And the other thing too is that a lot of times what happens is people receive these microaggressions and they just receive it and they take it and they take it. And then you have that last, comment or that last snub or whatever it is, and people explode. And so then you have on the opposite end, the person who's sort of on the receiving end of the reaction saying, why are you overreacting so much?
Yeah.
Big deal, calm down. And, it's not something where we have to take it. Like there's no playbook saying you have to accept a microaggression, and there's no playbook for saying how you have to react, because it just is really complicated when it comes to this, because it's not just if X plus Y equals Z.
It's not a formula, yeah.
There's so much that goes into it. And one other thought too, before I kind of turn it back over to you, is that a lot of times we do see that people who are from more underrepresented groups tend to be more on the receiving end of microaggressions. And so a lot of times when people are confronted with the fact that they may have committed a microaggression, they want to learn, and they place that burden of teaching on the person who received the microaggression. And so I do want to say that unless it's your actual literal job, like it's my job to teach about microaggressions, it's not that person's job to teach why something is offensive or why they reacted in a certain way. And I do want to name that, especially given the current state of the world, where I think a lot of people are having more conversations around, you mentioned, Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. A lot of people are, I think, having these discussions and really wanting to understand and learn where maybe they weren't in that mindset before. And so just to keep in mind that part of the work is doing your own work and not relying or assuming that others will help you to do that work for you. And I know I shared a lot.
No, I followed that. I know they followed it. I think those are all important things. And also it makes me feel, I guess, validated in the sense that like, I don't have to have this like legal defense worthy explanation on why you can't do that. Sometimes I feel like when people tell you to calm down and you're trying to explain why, or like, tell me why that's a microaggression, you're like, I shouldn't have, like, it almost comes across like I have to have this like amazing case, like a legal case kind of vibe. And like, unless you are convinced, then I'm still in the wrong, So okay, so I want to get into the how to respond. So you are microaggressed against, you are one of those three things. How do you respond? How do you do it so that you are no longer getting 1,000 cuts? And then I want, like, if you can give it to us, like specific language, like what do I say?
Yeah, so because microaggressions can be really subtle, they can trigger these reactions, a lot of time emotional reactions within us, but later on leave that person who's on the receiving end questioning yourself. And that's also really harmful too, because you're like, oh, I'm being paranoid, I'm being oversensitive. And so a lot of times there's this internal sort of dialogue or battle that's going on. So a couple things that I like to advise when helping people think through how to respond if you're on the receiving end. And I'll also talk about the flip of that in a moment as well. But if you're on the receiving end, if you're the target of a microaggression, the first thing, as I just mentioned, it's not your job to teach. And I just want to reiterate that, because that burden does tend to fall disproportionately on the shoulders of people who are the victims of microaggressions. So it's not your job to teach. With that being said, if you are in an emotional and mental and physical space where you feel safe and you feel like you want to engage in that discussion, that can be really productive. But again, only if you feel safe, whether that's physical safety, psychological safety, whatever that means for you in that moment. And so if you do choose to respond, one way to do so is to respond in a way that takes a little bit of space so that it's not directly attacking the person. And I want to say that we talk a lot about this idea of intent versus impact. And so the way that I think about this is that in my work, I like to recognize intent, but address the impact. And so there very well can be micro or even macroaggressions that are committed where the person who's doing so has ill intent. But a lot of times we do see that people are coming from a place of good intentions. If that is the case, that's fine to recognize that, but you really have to address the impact. And so one way to help create a little bit of space there so that you can actually have a conversation versus a debate is to address what was said or the behavior or the actions versus the person. And so that's a practice and a skill that you can really kind of develop over time. But also just remember that you can show up differently in different times yourself. And so for me, you know, what might land as a microaggression in one moment might not in another moment, depending on if it's my friend or my family member versus a stranger on the street versus a client versus somebody else. And so, or even just what mental headspace I'm in. Again, if you're on the receiving end, you don't have to be in this discussion alone. So reach out to your peers for support. Sometimes that also means just having that emotional support, but it could even mean tagging someone in. I like that phrase around tagging someone in. I can share really quickly. So you mentioned my partner in crime, my co-founder and co-CEO, Rachel Murray. She's actually based out on the West Coast, whereas I have certain identities. I'm biracial, I'm disabled. Rachel is you know, a white woman. And so we have some different identities there. And sometimes, you know, I'm present and I'm able to be in a conversation with somebody. And other times I just don't have the emotional bandwidth or the time or the wherewithal. And especially around a lot of the work a lot of what's been happening in our world over the past month or two with the protests and police brutality and the renewed emphasis and sort of spotlight on Black Lives Matter, we've also had a lot of conversations in our community around, you know, how to be anti-racist, what we stand for as a community. And there was an example that I'm thinking of where a few weeks ago, someone was posting in our community Slack and they were saying, oh, well, yes, but all lives really matter. And you know, it really was a trigger for me because I had just shared about why I am choosing not to support All Lives Matter, why we're focusing on Black Lives Matter, why this discussion is even happening. And this person immediately responded with All Lives Matter, and then also followed up with a pretty not great video that was very sort of inflammatory and not based on real facts and science. And my immediate reaction was to not have a conversation with this person and to just shut them down. And so I actually reached out to Rachel and I said, hey, I'm tagging you in. Like, this is a white woman who has not done the work yet. And I don't have the bandwidth to enter into this conversation with her right now. If I do, I don't think it's going to be productive for anyone. And I don't want to because I'm overwhelmed and I'm feeling my own feelings right now. And so I tagged Rachel in and she jumped in and she had a conversation with this person and really sort of stepped up. And so that's part, I think, of that internal dialogue that you may be having if you're on the receiving end of microaggressions, where you may be thinking, do I want to engage with this person? Do I not? What would the outcomes be? And so you can be reaching out for support if that's something that you're able to do. And then finally, and this is something I always say when I'm talking about this from thinking about if you're on the receiving end, you have the option of not responding. Like, it's not required to respond. If you can, great. If it makes sense, great, but you don't have to. And that's sort of how I
feel like, though, like, I would want to respond because I feel like the death of 1,000 cuts is sort of one of those things where at some point, and you're right, you don't have to respond, of course. And then you can also tag someone, which is why allyship and advocacy is so vital. And everyone needs to learn like what that really means. But I think let's give an example of when you do want to respond, because what I find is the struggle is, how do I respond? Like, what is the sentence I say to that person where I don't overthink it for the next 10 years about this comment, right? So let's say I'm just gonna play the microaggressor in this example. Let's say I say to you, Felicia, wow, you're like really smart and like good at tech for a biracial woman. Total bad microaggression. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so if I were to choose to respond, I would say there's a couple ways I could respond. One way would be, just off the top of my head, Hey, Lauren, thank you so much for that statement, but it actually came across as a little bit offensive and a bit of a microaggression for me. And if you're willing to talk about it further, I'd love to have a discussion to talk about why that statement can be a microaggression versus a compliment, which is what I think you meant when you initially shared that with me. So that's one way. I could also respond and say, hey, Lauren, I actually want to talk a little bit more about, why you said that, because I would like to think that I'm really smart and successful in my career because of my skills and my education, not because of my biracial identity or, the color of my skin. So, can we have a little bit more of a conversation around that? I could also just say, hey, that was a microaggression. Here's some articles. Go read some more on your own. That's probably not going to be, you probably would find that last approach a little bit more, abrupt perhaps. But there's a million ways to respond. What I have found personally really effective has been, again, to try and separate it from me saying, hey, Lauren, you're being offensive to me, and focusing more on the, hey, Lauren, these words are a microaggression, or this language is not the language. And so that separates a little bit, it creates a little bit of space there. So if you're on the receiving end of this discussion, you're not, well, hopefully you're not thinking, oh, she's attacking me. It's not about an attack or not. It's really about how do we have dialogue with each other. Right. And again, that's where it gets complicated, because sometimes what is done or said is so offensive that maybe that's not really what we want to do. We may not want to have dialogue. We may want to just shut down the action or the behavior. If you are walking down the street and you see, a group of white people beating up a Black person, you don't want to have a dialogue and say, hey, this is offensive.
Time out. Yeah.
Not the approach, right? And so that's going to require a different way of being in that space. And I think we're seeing a lot of this, and allyship, you mentioned it, it's very closely tied up into a lot of this. We're seeing a lot of allyship in action with these recent emergence of all these protests, where we're seeing, and I'm going to bring it back to racial sort of interactions, where we're seeing white people put their bodies in front of Black people because they have that privilege, and they know that the police may not be as quick to, beat someone up who's white versus someone who's a Black protester. And so that's one way of sort of addressing that macroaggression, really, not so much microaggression. But there's also a lot of things to be thinking of if you're the person who committed the microaggression. And what I like to say is that if someone comes to you and shares that what you did or what you said or how you acted was a microaggression, it can be really hard to take that information in, because I think that for most of us, at the core of who we are, we want to be good people and we see ourselves as good people. And when someone shares something like this, the immediate kind of mental place that we go to, and I'm saying this because I've been there too, is we're like, oh, I'm a terrible person. And, I'm not a terrible person. So let me be really defensive and push back on you. And so there's that immediate, defensiveness that tends to come up a lot when someone is trying to enter into a dialogue around what's going on. And it's hard because we all make mistakes. We're human beings. And so it's just part of how we act and how we show up as humans. We're all going to make mistakes. No one is perfect. Yeah. But it's really about what do you do once you've been made aware that there is a failure or there's a mistake or something has happened. Yeah. And how I like to think about it is that if someone shares with me how they were offended by a microaggression, it's basically a gift of communication that they're sharing with me. And if I am trying to be anti-racist, if I'm trying to better myself, if I'm trying to be in this work, I have to take these moments as learning opportunities and areas for growth, and not look at it as, oh, I fell down and now I'm a horrible person. And I've made mistakes and I'm in this work very deeply. And it's really about how do I grow from that? Mm-hmm. And so a critical first step, if you're the person who's on this committing side of the equation, is to apologize and listen. Yeah. And that sounds very simple, but it is very hard to do.
And so many people, I feel like now too, are trying not to say sorry, because we've done the whole thing about don't over apologize. This is the time to apologize, you guys. Sorry when you're trying to say excuse me is different than I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, or I'm sorry I did that.
It's a difference between saying like, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yeah.
Puts it back on the person, like, oh, it's your issue, and saying, you know, I'm sorry, are you in a space where you can share more? And part of that apology is really acknowledging the other person's reality. And this is where it gets very difficult, because one of the things I also talk a lot about is how, Lauren, your experience, your lived experience, your identities, your background, all of the things that make you who you are at this moment in time, and that lens that you're viewing the world through can be really different and actually completely in opposition to my lens and how I view the world. And so really the work is, how do we hold both of these truths as truths at the same time when they're not the same?
Yep.
And that's very difficult to do. It's something that it's a skill you have to work at really hard. And so, you know, I've been in positions where I've looked at a situation and I'm thinking, big deal, whatever, but someone else is looking at it and experiencing it in a really different way. And so I really have to make sure that I'm remembering that even though I may not be experiencing something, I have certain identities, but I may not share that experience. Or even if I had the same exact identity as someone else, they may be processing it in a very different way. Yep. And so how do you really make sure that you're acknowledging their experience, so that you're not just completely shutting them down? And part of the work too is taking ownership of your own awareness, your own understanding, your privileges, understanding where you have privilege, where you don't, where you may have these learned prejudices that we all carry within us. And again, just to say it one more time, intent does not equal impact. And so a lot of times our immediate reaction is we want to say, oh, I didn't mean it that way. You know, oh, I meant it as a compliment. Well, guess what? Maybe the person didn't receive it as a compliment.
Yeah.
They received it as something really,
and that matters. How they receive it matters. So my takeaways here on how to respond are, make it about the action, not about the person, and to use I statements versus you statements to help with that defensiveness. This is just, I'm gonna, I guess, give my takeaways from the person who is receiving a microaggression, and then I'll do my takeaways for the person who is giving a microaggression. No, I love it. No, and this is, I think, helpful because you are the master, you are the teacher, and I want to make sure that I've got my takeaway. So for me to respond to a microaggressor, I might say, Felicia, I really enjoy working with you. You know, this is a great project. In that meeting, there was a comment about the fact that I'm on this project because I'm a woman and we needed more women on the project, or whatever. I'm making this up as I go. That I perceive that as a microaggression because I believe that I'm on this project because of my skill set, not because I'm a woman. You know, I wanted to bring that to your attention, or to your attention, that I perceived that as something that wasn't helpful and beneficial to our meeting. Did I pass?
Yes. And then if I was the person responding, the work here is to not say, oh, you know, whatever, Lauren, or you're crazy, or you're just making it up in your head. The work is to say, thank you for sharing that with me. I appreciate, and I know that it may have been hard for you to do so. You know, let's maybe talk a little bit more about it. I want to share, you know, my thought process behind that statement, but I also want to hear, you know, how I hear that it landed in a way that I did not intend. And so I want to make sure that I correct myself in the future. And so how do we—
I like that. I like the, that landed differently than the intention. I like that. That's like a really good phrase of, in the meeting, this thing happened, or, you know, this action occurred. So, you know, I wanted to speak to you about this action that occurred. It didn't landed the way it was probably perceived, and giving somebody like kind of the benefit of the doubt that their intentions are good. You know, can we talk about how to do that differently in the future? Or can we talk about why that didn't land correctly? I like those. I like that it didn't land the way it was, because I feel like I'm a big person of like, I like to have phrases that I feel like I can manipulate to the situation. But like, for example, in a salary negotiation, I really like when people say, will you consider? Or like, I'd like you to consider. For whatever reason, the word consider for me softens it, right? And I think that it didn't land the way it was perceived or the intention softens this for me a little bit.
Yeah, and I think I love the conversation that's happening, and I'm only able to catch little bits of it here and there. I think actually there's been some additional phrases that have been shared, and one that I think I saw was saying things like, what did you mean by that? Or what you are saying or what you're doing is offensive. And so just having these types of phrases or language, I like to say in your toolbox or in your back pocket.
Yeah.
Visible toolbox, having these phrases at the ready can be really helpful, because a lot of times when something's happening and we're in the moment, it's hard. It's overwhelming. And, whether you're on the receiving end, whether you're on the person who's been confronted with the fact that you committed microaggression, or even if you're watching or witnessing something happening and you're not actually directly involved, it can be really hard to sort of react, say something, process if you've never thought about it before. And sometimes we don't do anything or we don't address it because we don't literally know what to say.
Yeah.
And I call these phrases like ally responses or whatever you want to call it. But there's a million different ways to think about how to sort of either start a conversation or be in a conversation. And the last thing I want to touch on is what happens if you are that person who's seeing something going on, but you're not directly involved. How do you still have a voice, and how do you be present in that? And so having these phrases can be really helpful. One of my personal favorite phrases to use is just really simple, not cool. Really short, really simple. And you know what? Like, that's my little ally phrase that I have in my toolbox. I've used it in person. I've also used it over Slack, over chat, because I know we're in this virtual world now, which, guess what? You can still have microaggressions happening in a virtual environment. It's not limited to just in person. And so just having that ability to know that if I want to say something, I don't have to sit there and think about what is the perfect phrase. How should I craft this language? I can just, not cool.
Yeah.
And then I can go from there. And then I can see sort of where it develops. But it could also be, instead of saying, oh, you hurt her feelings. Like, let's say you and I had that conversation that we just kind of role played through a little bit. Mm-hmm. And Joe Schmo over here jumps on in and is like, Lauren, you hurt her, or Felicia, you hurt Lauren's feelings by saying that. And maybe that's not actually the case, because we may not always know what's going on, what the relationships are, what the context is, how it's landing. And so instead of saying, oh, you hurt her feelings, or you hurt his feelings, saying something like, here's how I'm taking this, here's why I'm offended. I saw this happen, I heard this happen, I heard this conversation, and you're taking that burden off of that person who may or may not be on the receiving end of the microaggression, and you're placing it on yourself, and you're saying, I'm offended because of XYZ. And you mentioned earlier using that I versus you language. That's really powerful. And just really making sure to, again, not put undue burden. Don't speak on behalf of someone else. Don't take away their voice, because that can also be a form of a microaggression. And I don't think that people should really, in general, try to speak on behalf of others, especially marginalized groups or people who are from historically marginalized groups, because it can be unintentionally dehumanizing. So that's really important to say, this is happening, I'm offended, or I'm processing it this way. Create that separation a little bit.
Chris Voss, who's a negotiation expert, he has this, which I guess could kind of work in this. He has this tool called mirroring, where you mirror the last 3 words that the person says. So let's say they said, you're really smart for being a woman. You would respond with, I'm really smart for being a woman. And you say it with this very curiosity thing. And it makes, you can use that in negotiation, but you could also use it someone saying not cool would work with my boss. I think you can restate what they said. You can say it with a really curious voice. I think you could say, yikes. I think you can say, Alicia Menendez also says that when someone, another good phrase is compared to whom. So if they're saying you're really smart for a woman, you can say, compared to whom? Who are you comparing me to? All women, a specific woman. So, okay, I think we've given everybody a lot of amazing phrases and tool sets on how to respond to microaggressions. Let's get into the questions. So the first one comes from Megan, who said, I have a work conflict, but I'm looking forward to watching the recording. Oh, okay. That's her schedule. Okay, this is a great topic. Okay, my question. Do you have any advice for how best to address microaggressions when they come up in a group context? Is it best to say something right away in front of everyone, even if this person may be in a higher position than you, or would it be best to speak with them privately after the meeting? Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, it really depends. That's sort of the classic answer, right? It depends. But what I can share is that sometimes it can be really impactful to address something in the moment, especially in a group setting. And so, again, like we were just saying, you could comment on the reaction in the room if something's been said. So saying something like, oh, I noticed there was a reaction to what you just said. Let's use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about why saying X, Y, Z is a microaggression. I want to acknowledge that this is happening. Other times you may not feel able to say something or address something in the moment. And I want to note that a lot of this comes down to who you are, who's in the room with you, what are the titles, what's the power, what are the privileges that are going on? Because let's say that you are a junior person who just got hired into a company and you're in a meeting virtually or non-virtually, and the CEO says something really offensive. You may not feel able to address that in the moment to correct the CEO because you are new, you don't have any relationships, you don't have any network, et cetera, et cetera. And so in that moment, you may choose to not say something. Sometimes it can be really impactful to have a conversation separately and pull someone aside. And so using that same example, maybe you talk to a trusted fellow coworker or a manager or someone who maybe can escalate that or is on the same level or has some kind of relationship with that same person so that it's not coming in the moment, but it's coming separately. I can share a really quick real life example. I mentioned earlier that we run these diversity, equity, inclusion trainings for clients of all shapes and sizes. And so recently, I was on a call, like a prep call with a new client and one of our facilitators who happens to be a Black woman. And on the call, the client started making some comments which were about her hair. And that's definitely an area where you can experience a lot of microaggressions, especially as an African-American or Black woman. And so this was a classic example for me of, do I address this in the moment? Do I not? How do I approach this? Because I need to approach it in some way. And so what I ended up doing was I privately messaged my teammate and I said, I'm going to address this separately after the call. So I'm going to ask you to hop off and I'm going to stay on once we're done. And she said, great, thank you. So at the end of the call, I said, hey, client X and Z, can you stay on for a few more minutes? To my teammate, feel free to hop off. And she was like, great, goodbye. So she left. And then I basically said to them, hope you have a couple extra minutes. I want to offer you some feedback if you're open to it.
I like that phrase too.
And so that was sort of like the entry point into our conversation. And so we ended up having a really nice conversation around that. But I chose to address it separately. I chose to not have my teammate be part of it because I didn't want her to have to teach, even though that is part of her job description. But in that moment, I was like, you know what, I'm taking the burden off of her. I'm going to be the one who addresses it because it doesn't have to be her job to do this. And she was the one who was sort of on the receiving end of the microaggression. And so I had that conversation. And also there was that element of power in there because these were clients. They're paying us money, but I'm the CEO of the company. And so there's that power dynamic that I can bring to the conversation that's different than if she were to have initiated the conversation. So I do think, going back to the question, it depends, but that's something you want to be thinking about is, what are the relationships? What are the power dynamics? Where might it be more or less feasible or appropriate to have it in person or a separate private conversation?
Yeah, I think for me, and I agree, I think the big answer is it depends. I would probably do a first time private. If they do it again, they get the public. That's probably how I would work. And then I would almost use that as a, we've discussed this previously, but if you're open to this feedback, please don't address it like that. I do feel like
it really depends. I mean, classic ways that we see this come up in groups is in meetings where people, and I'm going to use the gender binary here, men versus women. We see just so much anecdotal research, all this evidence out there that women tend to get talked over more. They'll share an idea, and then 5 minutes later, a guy will say the same idea, and everyone's like, "Oh, such a great idea!" Yeah. And so things like that can be very impactful in the moment to say, "Hey, thanks, Bob, for sharing that." I think Jane actually said that a couple minutes ago. Jane, do you want to add anything to explain what you originally stated? So things like that can be really impactful in the moment. But even that example, it could also be paired with a, separate private conversation, pulling Bob aside and saying, "Hey, I've noticed that you constantly talk over all the women during the meeting, and it's something that's a sort of repeated behavior. Let's address this." But so there's again, it's complicated. There's room for a lot of different interpretations of how to approach it.
All right, so next question. So we've got 10 more minutes, so let's try to get through 5 questions if we can. Okay, so Mallory said, how do you support in the moment of other BIPOC individuals who are being publicly microaggressed while also being microaggressed yourself by white individuals?
Yeah, and for anyone who's not familiar with this terminology, BIPOC, it stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color individuals. And so the question is, how do you support in the moment other people who are being publicly microaggressed, but also being yourself being microaggressed by white people? Yeah, it's interesting because one thing that we're actually thinking a lot about is, if you're trying to act as an ally for others, people of color can microaggress each other. It's not something where, oh, as a person of color, I'm sort of exempt from that. But at the same time, the flip is very valid too. And so I would say, again, like if you have the emotional bandwidth, the physical safety, the psychological safety to speak up, it can be really impactful, especially if you share that identity with the person who's being microaggressed, to say, hey, like, I noticed you said XYZ. As a person of fill in the blank, I can tell you that's really offensive. And I think just, again, remembering that this is going to be, the way that you choose to show up can be really different. And so you may be able to be in that conversation today, Wednesday, but tomorrow, Thursday, maybe you're not. And so just, again, practicing those responses, practicing how you might want to have a phrase at the ready, or say, that's offensive, or why is that funny? Can you explain it to me? We don't talk like that here. That language is not approved. It's against our code of conduct. Like, there's a lot of ways to get into that, beyond even just, is it, a person of color versus white person. But I think in general, also the conversation overall in our society right now, at this moment in time, we are seeing a lot of white people who are newly coming to the conversation, and they're probably going to be making mistakes. And so just really saying, hey, you may not realize that phrase is really offensive, but as a person of color or as a BIPOC person, love to point you in some direction of some resources for you to do some additional work, so that, we don't have to have this happening in the moment.
And Catherine asked, just really quick, as kind of a part 2 to this, she said, as a white person, how can I support BIPOC coworkers when our boss uses microaggressions against them? Is it best to ask my coworkers later whether and how they want me to support them? So if you want to be an ally, do you think it's helpful to ask, like, hey, is it better for me to speak up? Like, should you ask first?
Again, there's no like right or wrong answer here. I think it can be very impactful to just jump in and not have to say, hey, can I do this? Like, do you want me to do this? Because a lot of times, like, again, remember that if you're on the receiving end of a microaggression, you may be in your own head in that moment too, and be overwhelmed, be questioning yourself. And so having someone support your reality, your experience, without having to even process it fully yourself, can be really, really powerful.
Yeah.
At the same time, remember too, as I shared earlier with that example of having my co-founder tag in for a conversation, sometimes the conversation will land really differently depending on who's delivering the message. And so if the boss in question in this question is white, and is committing a microaggression against a person of color, then having a white coworker jump in, it might land differently with that boss because of the identity of the person sharing, versus if the person of color who's on the receiving end were to. I have a friend who has some friends who are lawyers in the New Jersey area. There's a viral video that just kind of went viral in the last day or two, where I think they're either African American or BIPOC. I'm not sure what their identities are. They're putting a patio in. Their white women neighbor came over and started harassing them. And what was really wonderful to see was that they live in a very white neighborhood. Their white neighbors jumped in and sort of like shut down this woman really quickly and said, just like, didn't even have to ask, are you okay? Do we need to do anything? They just sort of did it without having to have that permission. On the flip side, I think it also can be really, really helpful to go separately to someone and say, hey, I have noticed what is happening. Yeah. Are there other ways I can support you, or even just validate that experience? And so I shared an example in the beginning around, having a senior leader call the same two Latina people in the office by each other's name. So there's a way to address that in the moment, but there's also a way to support the people separately and say, hey, I noticed that the boss always calls you the other person's name. I just want you to know that I plan to address it separately, or I just want you to know that we're not ignoring it. Like the office sees it, it's not okay. Because that silence can, as we've been hearing a lot recently, silence can lead to this idea of complicity. And so you want to make sure that you're also supporting and acknowledging what's going on.
Yeah, I also agree that acknowledging that's happening also might give the other person confidence to speak up and speak against the microaggression a little bit more. Like, hey, I notice this keeps happening. And then next time it happens, they might be like, oh, I can speak up because other people are noticing this too. It's not just me.
Or even just feel like you're not alone.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not completely out here on my own having to deal with this in this crazy reality where no one else seems to care or realize it or whatever is happening.
Yeah. Okay. So Jen said, and hopefully we can get through a few more of these. I know these are tough. You guys, these are tough because the answers are always needing to be a little bit longer. How to deal with a boss who is intentionally undermining you, having other employees CC her on any email responses to you, directing other employees to not return your phone calls on specific projects, documenting things in writing that are false, and perceived efforts to build a case against you.
Yeah, this one's tricky. And I would say this actually sounds like it might be more in terms of like a legal HR approach that you might want to be thinking about taking. But if it's something that's not necessarily, like, what we have to also think about is the interactions that are just sort of daily interactions versus it sounds like maybe the boss is trying to make a case to, sort of put you on a performance improvement plan or ease you out for whatever reason. And in that case, that's more of a, how do you address that with HR? But I would say in general, like, if you're in a situation like this, getting things in writing, keeping documentation of your own, again, reaching out to support of your own so that they can either validate for you or have, testimonials on your behalf or support you, and just really not trying to address it by yourself and really leaning on the support that you hopefully have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, Jen, don't forget this is a time that's like such a unique, personalized situation that probably requires more context. That working with a career coach, we have career coaches on Career Contessa. That might also be helpful if you don't feel like HR is a good resource for you. Okay. Next question comes from Jen. What is the best way to jump in when someone turns to the marginalized in the room and expects that person to teach them / be the spokesperson for an entire marginalized group? I've seen it handled very poorly and just layering microaggressions on microaggressions. So I feel like we kind of discussed this a little bit, but I think this question is like, how can you respond when someone's expecting you to be the teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I like to say that humor can be really effective, but it can also be very dangerous. So this might be a case where I might try to go down that route depending on who's in the room and kind of what's going on. And if I felt like it was appropriate, I might try to turn it into a joke almost and be like, oh, I was just listening to a webinar where they told us this was going to happen. And, here we are, we're expecting, Mary as the only Black woman to speak for all Black women. But, would love to redirect that because as we know, we shouldn't be doing this or that's not the case. So that could be like a more lighthearted way to approach it. But like I said, it can be a little bit tricky depending on what your situation is. Sometimes I think it's just really helpful to name things in the moment. And so this is where having meeting norms, having group norms, having structures for the way that you're working with each other can be really helpful. I know that some of the clients I've worked with, they've set it in place so that we have like, if they were in a physical space together, they have a little cup with little, red pencils or red little flags. And so they're able to kind of wave it and be like, oh, not cool. Or take a time out to say, hey, let's redirect the conversation. If you don't have that kind of system or structure in place, it's something to think about. How can we, as a team, put in place some processes to handle this? And again, like thinking about how do we act as an ally and just say, hey, why don't we table this discussion for later? Why don't we redirect? How about I answer that question instead? There's a lot of things we can think about it.
I'm going to put a link to this, you guys. We have a management course on Career Contest. It's called the New Manager Manual, but any manager could take it. And one of the assignments or takeaways that you build in the course is an employee handbook. And I actually think an employee handbook is a really important thing to have, because it would basically set the guidelines of like maybe language you use, how meetings are conducted. You can get as detailed as possible. And then everybody has this like starter pack of how you do things. So that's just something I would just highly recommend in general. But I think especially when it comes to talking about some of the topics we're discussing. Okay, so let's take one more question. Felicia, do you have time for one more?
Yes, we can do it. Let's
do it. Okay, so this person said, my current boss humiliates me all the time since I and her were the competitors for the role and she won and I lost. Now she wants to remove me from the company and she does everything to ensure that I look bad or my performance is substandard. I fought for almost eight months and now I feel I'm losing it and it's affecting my self-confidence. What do I do? My self-confidence was so low that I even thought about committing suicide. I think this is a very serious question. And I think that the first thing I want to just mention in this question before we get to answering it is that if you are considering suicide, I highly, highly recommend seeking a professional mental health resource. And I'm also going to drop in here the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So I want to put that in the chat. I'll also put it in the comments. The number is 1-800-273-8255. So we take this question really seriously, and yes, please do reach out for help. Felicia, let's talk about the other part of this question, which is a boss who maybe humiliates somebody or maybe goes out of their way to have, as you said, these microaggressions that aren't micro and they're really obvious too.
Yeah, and I'm seeing there's a lot of really great comments to this particular question. And so thank you to everyone who jumped in to help support this person, and agree with everything we just said, Lauren, too, around the help aspect of it. In this case, it sounds like it's not so much a microaggression as a macroaggression, and maybe even just outright discrimination. I think it's always tricky when you have that relationship of management, or maybe the person was a coworker before, that sounds like this was the case, and now they're elevated or you're elevated above them. And so, it sounds like perhaps it doesn't sound like this is a very healthy environment for you to be in. And even though I hate to say this, I think it sounds like perhaps if there's nothing to be done from the legal or HR aspect, I would highly recommend that you look to transfer a team or in the company, because this is not a situation you want to be in long term, because you should not be thinking and feeling this way. Now, that being said, it doesn't sound like your performance is substandard. It sounds like there's a personal vendetta of some sort going on. And so again, documentation is really important. Reaching out for that support is really important. Looping in your HR team, hopefully that you have one at your company who you trust, you can go to. And making sure that you're protecting yourself, because work should never your work should not lead you to this point.
Yeah, it is. And also just to acknowledge that there are bad bosses, there are bad workplaces, there are bad things that happen to smart, talented workers, and nothing is worth your health. So highly recommend that this is not probably the company for you to work at. So, and so I just want to acknowledge that you're not probably imagining these things, that bad workplaces happen to good people. That is an unfortunate reality. Well, Felicia, thank you so much for spending time with us on this Wednesday and just giving us a good 101 course of microaggressions. I really hope that people will share this webinar with their companies and their other employees. I think that this has been incredibly helpful for all the different types of microaggressions and people who fall into both sides. So let's talk about where people can find you. And also, you guys, if you work for an organization that needs to bring in someone like Felicia to work with your company, you know, this is the work. Felicia is the person you hire to come into your company. So that's a good resource, I think, also to have. So just kind of end it by letting people know where they can find you and kind of next steps.
Absolutely. So you can find us at our website is www.shegeeksout.com, and our social media handles are at She Geeks Out. I'll just drop it in the chat really quickly as well. And so feel free to reach out. And yes, we are doing lots of work in this area. Always happy to chat with people about how we might be able to help support the work you're doing. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a wonderful, vibrant community of women and their allies as well. So feel free to check that out too. But thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit more. And I also want to know, I know there's been so much great conversation going on. And, you know, really an hour, we barely scratched the surface for something. The topic of microaggressions is very deep and heavy, and there's a lot to it. We could probably have spent days just talking about this. Detail.
I also think so many of you have been connecting with each other in the chat. Remember that you can be each other's resources as well. So find someone in here to be an accountability partner, to be someone that you can talk to if you are both, you know, in toxic workplaces. I think that one of the takeaways for me too is having someone acknowledge and someone who, you know, maybe is experiencing something similar can also be helpful to kind of, you know, go through the thought process and the brainstorm of how you want to respond to. So remember that this community is your resource as well. Thank you, Felicia. Everybody have an amazing Wednesday, and I'll send the replay out. Bye.